and so feel free to jump in and interrupt me or ask questions or whatever, and I'm happy to stop and answer them. I think I can't see the chat on my screen, so Chuck will let me know if there's anything going on. Actually, maybe I can. Yeah, actually, okay. Actually, now I can see it. But anyway, feel free to yell at me if you want to stop. So today I want to cover a few points. I'll tell you a little bit about me. I think Chuck covered a lot of it. So that's good. We can get through that pretty quickly. I'll give you probably the world's quickest history of medical device regulation because it's all of one slide. And then I'm going to get into really the bulk of the talk, which is about regulatory science and safety and effectiveness of medical devices. And that's something that you always have to keep in the forefront of your mind. And I'll explain why you do that and how you do that as you kind of move along from the back of your cocktail napkin where you've designed your next greatest product all the way to the bedside. And then I want you to understand a little more the nitty-gritty. For example, once you've got this terrific baby, this device that's yours and you want to commercialize it, how do you actually do it? Which way do you go? What is required? What do you need really to get there? And then I'll close with a little bit about clinical investigations because it's something you very likely will have to face. Yeah, Chuck did talk about my random walk. So this is me here at the bottom here, this little stick figure. And I thought I was just going to kind of become a surgeon, but I ended up, you know, getting my degrees, as you've heard. I did my residency in general surgery and my fellowship in cardiothoracic. And, you know, as a surgeon, you play with devices a lot. And so every day I'm using devices, simple things like scalpels and forceps, and complicated things like heart-lung machines and stuff like that. And I kind of realized as I was working with some of these companies, and Chuck mentioned Medtronic, but there were also some companies that they were startups. They don't even exist anymore. I mean, some of them, you know, went out of business. I was dealing with devices in every which way. And I came to the realization that I didn't know how these devices came to be. You know, I knew how to use them, but I was really at the very, very end of the line. And so when my professional society, the Society for Thoracic Surgeons in 2008, put out a blast email saying, hey, you guys, the FDA has a thing called a medical device fellowship. I said, oh, you know, that sounds interesting. Let me go learn about how medical devices sort of come to be from a regulatory perspective, and how are they regulated, and what's necessary to get them on the market and keep them on the market and so forth. And that began my relationship with the FDA for the next 12 years. And so during that period of time, I got interested in a lot of other things, for example, health informatics, and I went on to get a master's degree and eventual board certification in that. I got interested in artificial intelligence and helped write the white paper that came out about a year ago on adaptive AI algorithms in medical devices and how they should be regulated. And so I've kind of been bumping into the walls, going, you know, along these arrows, and I ended up at Echo. And I don't know, maybe I could have gone that way straight, but I would have not enjoyed the experiences I had along the way and learned what I have and gotten to meet the people I did. So I've enjoyed my little walk. Now, remember, I promised you the shortest history in the universe of medical device regulation, and here it is. So really, the slide should probably actually start in the middle here, because the Food and Drug Administration actually came about 114 years ago, as a result of the Pure Food and Drug Act, which was because people were selling literally snake oil and people were getting hurt. And so Congress did something to put an administration in place. And it wasn't until 1938, however, so what's that, 32 years later, that there really was an act of Congress that gave the Food and Drug Administration teeth to enforce regulations and laws that allowed the government to ensure the safety of medical products. Now, what you'll notice here is I have highlighted the word drug, or put the word drug in bold, because from 1938 until 1976, so 38 years, there were no regulations covering medical devices. Now, that doesn't mean that medical devices didn't exist or that we didn't use them. We sure did. And people were making medical devices all the time. But there were no regulations about medical devices. And I know that's kind of mind-boggling, but it finally happened in 1976 through a separate Medical Device Regulation Act that essentially the umbrella was expanded now to provide for the safety and effectiveness of medical devices. And that is what led to the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health and my interaction with the FDA and so forth. So it's really been over the last, what is that, 44 years that we've had regulations really directed at medical devices. And here I just put something here. This is really from the FDA mission statement, that the FDA is responsible for protecting the public health by ensuring the safety of all of these things it covers: the food supply, cosmetics, products that emit radiation, drugs, biologicals, etc. So there, now you can take a test on the history of medical device regulation. Now, the nitty-gritty, what I want to get into today is really about regulatory science. And I'll tell you, when I first came to the FDA, people said to me, "What's regulatory science?" And I couldn't answer the question. I mean, what is regulatory science? Well, there is a definition, and that is that regulatory science is a scientific and technical foundation upon which our regulations are based and written. And essentially, you think about it, well, what is the purpose of these scientific and technical efforts? It's always aimed at assessing the safety and effectiveness of whatever the proposed product is. And those are the two words that I'm going to keep coming back to. I put stars on them here. When you design your device, always think about it. Is it safe for use on the intended population? And that, by the way, the FDA covers veterinary stuff too. So whatever the population is, could be humans, could be animals. Is it effective at meeting its intended use? You can come up with a device that's really safe, but if the FDA looks at it and says, it's not really doing what it's supposed to do, you're not going to get on the market. So you got to think, is it safe and is it effective? And by the way, I put a little thing here. This is called Trivia of the Day, TOTD. The trivia of the day is that there is actually a difference in the definitions between effectiveness and efficacy. A lot of people say efficacy, I have to prove efficacy. Well, it turns out that efficacy is actually used mostly by my drug colleagues because they are referring to the results that are obtained from clinical trials conducted in a very idealized and controlled situation. At the Center for Devices, we're more concerned with effectiveness, which is, think of it as real world. And so we try to structure our clinical studies and our evidence to be based on real world experience as much as we can. If you want to use a device on certain populations of patients, for example, we want to see how it's used in that population. So we want to show effectiveness. So that's a little trivia of the day for you. There'll be a test later. Okay. Now let me just take a brief tangent into a legal glossary here. And the reason I'm doing this is because I'm going to be throwing a few of these words around and I want you to understand what the differences are. So when we talk about things from a legal perspective, you'll hear lawyers say things like, that's in the statute, or that's in the regulation, or that's in the guidance document. And what does that mean? Statutes are things that are written by lawmakers. They're things that come out of Congress or state legislatures. It's the law. And it's referred to as Public Law 1234, something like that. They are all organized into a book, a humongous book called the U.S. Code, USC. And the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which is what I mentioned earlier from 1938, is actually in Title 21 of the U.S. Code, Chapter 9. And that is updated as additional laws and modifications are made and bits are repealed and other bits are added. That all goes into 21 USC Chapter 9. And here I've listed a couple of these alphabet soup words, which are essentially follow-up acts over the last 40 years that have modified the Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act. Now that's the law. If you break it, you break the law. If you don't follow it. Now regulations are a little bit different because regulations are not written by the legislative branch. They're written by the executive branch and its agencies. So regulations are those books that you see on the shelf that begin with Code of Federal Regulations. So in the United States, we call it the CFR. Now it's not the law, but it carries the force of law. And so if you don't follow the regulations and you're in violation, you can be prosecuted for that. So if it's in the book, in the CFR, you have to follow it. It's essentially the interpretation of the law, the application of the law by the agencies. And so the FDA writes in Title 21, it's interesting how it lines up, it's the same title number. Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations is all about food and drugs. So that's where all the stuff that I know and I'm going to teach you comes from. They can be rewritten, by the way, by executive direction. And so this is a lot of what you're hearing about now when there's an executive order to an agency to rewrite a regulation. That agency will rewrite that regulation according to that order. And as long as it doesn't violate the statute, you can change, directions of the way things go through executive action. Now, guidances are completely different. Guidances are documents that are written periodically to address certain issues. They represent the current thinking of that agency. They are not law. They are not regulation. You don't have to follow a guidance. But I'll put it to you this way. I've never run across, in 12 years at the FDA, I've never run across someone who didn't follow a guidance that applied to their activity, whatever it was. Applying for clearance or approval, generating certain kinds of evidence in certain situations, whatever it might be. Those things come through in terms of guidance. And some people accuse agencies of regulating by guidance, which they're not supposed to do. But if you don't follow the guidance, you're on, let's just say, some shaky ground. So I highly recommend you follow them. I call them strong hints, but nonetheless, they are not laws and they're not regulations. So hopefully this kind of frames what I'm going to talk about in the next few slides. This is just a really quick slide. And by the way, I will be going through some of these slides very quickly in the interest of time, but you're going to get the slide deck. So you will have this for your reference, at home. If we take a look at Title 21 in the Code of Federal Regulations, which, as I said, is all about food and drugs, we're really concentrating on Chapter 1 and Part H, or Subchapter H, I should say, because Subchapter H for today's talk is all about medical devices. And so if you are contemplating developing a medical device and marketing it in the United States into what we call interstate commerce, you should know these parts, 800.10 through 898.14. And don't worry, I'll give you an orientation to those things. You don't have to go home and read this tonight. I would highly not recommend that, but you should become familiar with it. So that's just an orientation of where all these different parts go. Now, why are we going to talk about regulatory science for the rest of this talk? Because I'm going to describe for you the interface between regulatory science and medical devices, and try to put the talk in the frame that you would be looking at it from your point of view. So, in other words, you are what's called the product sponsor. It's a weird term. It's actually in the regulations. And what it means by definition is that you are a person who initiates but does not actually conduct an investigation. In real life, the way the FDA thinks of a sponsor is that you are essentially any entity that appears in front of the agency to submit an application looking for marketing permission, basically. So if you want to introduce the device, you're the sponsor. So we refer to people as the sponsor should do this, or the sponsor submitted that, or whatever. So you might see that from time to time. Okay, why do you need to submit a marketing application? Well, I think I told you very, very early on that before we had an FDA and before we had a Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, people were doing anything they wanted. And there was unsafe products, there were ineffective products, et cetera. People were getting hurt. So there has to be a process in place to assure safety and effectiveness, right? There I go again, safety and effectiveness, that has to assure the safety and effectiveness of that product. So we do that through a marketing application process, and I'm going to take you through that. Now let's think of this in terms of what we call the total product life cycle, right? So here you are. This is not me, right? I was a different stick figure. This is you now. You are this stick figure. And you're sitting around one day and, you're having dinner with your friends, whatever it is, and this great idea comes to your mind. And you say, I want to build a device that does this. And so that's your concept. And you put it down on a cocktail napkin and, I guess you go off and patent it, right? Last week's speaker talked about patents, so you know all about that. But you're going to, do whatever. But you're going to go through this life cycle as your baby starts to grow and take shape and become a thing. So you're going to build a prototype. You're going to get your best friend who's an engineer. Maybe you're an engineer too, right? You're going to talk about, well, you know, what does it have to look like? What's it going to feel like? What's it going to do? And then you start thinking about things, well, if it's going to be used in humans, you know, I have to make sure that it's compatible with biological tissues, right? Biocompatibility. I have to make sure that the materials are durable. I have to make sure that there are no problems with toxins, you know, toxicology, all these things. And then you start to get into, you know, by doing that, what we call the preclinical phase. So essentially, you're not touching humans, but you're on the benchtop and you're doing these little things to figure out the toxicology and the biocompatibility. And, you know, there's a lot of resources for you out there on how to do these things. There are standards, international standards, et cetera. But this is what you're doing to kind of stand up your product, and you're trying to use it and break it and fix it and figure it out. Eventually, you get to the point where you think, okay, I've got something totally usable, and I want to now go figure out how would it actually work on a human or an animal, but let's say a human. And I need to show that it's safe and effective, okay? So how do I generate the evidence to show that it's safe and effective? And this is a lot of stuff that I did with a lot of these startup companies. They literally would come to me with a shoebox, a literal shoebox with some trinkets in it. They were like half a product or 3/4 of a product or something like that. And they would say, how would we use this on a human? And so I would provide them with some of the clinical context. And I would say, well, you know, you might use it like this, or no, I wouldn't use it like that. And then we would go and we would try it out on the benchtop and play with it. We might even take a little detour into some animal studies and try to use it on some animals. That's also considered preclinical, by the way. And all the way you're doing that, you're generating evidence. You're generating evidence that it's working, you're fixing problems to make it better, et cetera. But you do eventually reach that point where you say, I need to show it's safe and effective. And this is where you get into the clinical trials. And you say, okay, I want to put together a group of subjects, you know, human subjects that fit my intended use. So I want to use it on people with heart disease, or I want to use it on people with asthma, something like that. So you pick your population, who you're going to use it on. And then you say, I want to show that it decreases the, I don't know, I'm going to make something up. It actually, you know something, I don't need to make something up. I can actually use my device, the Echo Stethoscope, to give you an example. So here is an Echo Stethoscope. So I say, okay, this is going to be used on humans. All right, so there's my population. What's it going to do? It's going to pick up sounds from humans, and it's going to use this little module here to capture and transmit those sounds to my iPhone. Okay, so is it safe? I have to figure that out. Is it effective at doing what it's doing? I have to figure that out. So I need to come up with a population, and I need to do all the nitty-gritty stuff like how many people do I need? Is there a statistical endpoint I need to read? All that stuff that I'm not going to get into right now. But the point is, you need to put together a clinical trial. And when you get through that, now you come into this block right here. And I'm using the word block judiciously, but it sometimes can be a block, or it could sometimes just be a rectangle on the diagram. But the point is, you then have to marshal all that evidence and submit it as a marketing application for FDA to review. And we'll go into the details in a minute. And when you get approval of your marketing application, then you can actually go into real business, right? You can market it. I'm sorry, here we go, manufacture. You can manufacture it, you can market it, you get into commercial use, and eventually, of course, it becomes obsolescent or obsolete, and then you go through the process again with version 2 or whatever is your next great thing. So that's a long explanation for, I think, what is a very intuitive concept here, but hopefully you see where it goes, because what I'm going to do next is show you where things divide. At the FDA, we think of things as pre-market or post-market. And pre-market means that you are doing all of the stuff to the upper right-hand side of the slide, you know, on this side, so to speak, of the green line. Post-market means you're doing all the things on the bottom left of the green line. Essentially, pre-market is before you submit your marketing application. You're doing the concept, prototype, preclinical and clinical. You're gathering your evidence to make your case to get your device on the market. Post-market, it's already out there. It's out on the market. People are buying it. They're using it, et cetera. You're trying to demonstrate that it remains safe and effective, essentially. So that's where you're trying to survey your product. You're trying to continue to gather information, fix quality problems, et cetera. We are going to talk further about the pre-market space. So if we want to go back for a second to 21 CFR, these are the sections in that 800 range that you need to be most familiar with when you're talking about the pre-market segment. Now, it's kind of a shame that these are scattered around 800. It's not like a book that tells a story by any means. You kind of have to go from section to section, but you can find what you need in these sections. Like, what are the requirements for labeling? What are the requirements for registering and listing and all of this stuff? All this stuff is here. And I'm not going to spend any more time on this, but I just want to give you an orientation that this is the way the regulations are divided up for pre-market. There's a similar corresponding slide for post-market. These are the things you need to worry about and comply with for post-market. Like, for example, how do I do medical device reporting? How do I make a correction or removal or a recall, et cetera? Those and quality systems, those are all in the post-market space. So just to give you an idea of the division. And finally,
in the chat.
Oh, I'm sorry. In your slides, you only mentioned medical devices. Yes, so software is a tricky topic. The question is about software. Do the regulations apply to software? Some software is considered a medical device, some software is not, and that's laid out in the regulations. It actually will specifically say, except as in section whatever, and I can't remember the number of the section, but that section in the regulations and also in the statute, by the way, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act has been amended to say certain things are not medical devices. For example, storage of images or transmission of data into a health record. Those things are not medical devices. On the other hand, if your medical software provides what's called clinical decision support, so it provides the clinician with actionable information they can use to make a decision, that is a medical device. So you have to read through that a little bit to get a finer explanation than what I'm giving you right now, but it does apply to a lot of medical software, but not all medical software.
We will be having a talk on software as a medical device, probably late September, I think, late September. So take a look at your BMX schedule.
Perfect. So we call that SAMD, software as a medical device. Now there's this section really from the 860s onto the 890s, which is actually not what you would consider typical regulations. It's not like, it doesn't say thou shall do this. It's more just listings of devices. And this is kind of your reference book, because when you are forming this device and you are thinking, what's it going to be? This is where you would go to look and to see, where do I fit? So for example, you're making a stethoscope, and I'm making a stethoscope. This is, by the way, the second version of our device, the second generation. We would say, well, what kind of device is that? Is that an anesthesia device? Is that a cardiovascular device? So you need to find a spot where you fit. And I'm going to cover the instances where you can't find something. I'll talk about that. But in general, there are 150,000 medical devices on the market in the United States, and there are a lot of listings that cover them. So, you know, take a look through this, get an idea. And if you find something, you actually are well on your way to through the regulatory process. So I'll explain that as we go. Now you'll notice in this slide, I basically chopped off that lower left-hand part, right? I chopped off the post-market part, because what do engineers see and what the founders see? And sometimes, you know, they have a little bit of blinders on because they're not really looking at that post-market stuff, right? Like quality systems, why should I worry about that? Well, you do have to worry about that, but what most engineers and founders are thinking about is, how do I get this device up and running? How do I get this device ready for market? So they're really thinking about the right-hand side. So I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about that. Now, when our founder said in 2013, I want to make this stethoscope and I want to make it smart by putting artificial intelligence into it, he started asking questions along this part of the life cycle. He started saying, you know, well, what should the stethoscope actually do? You know, should it capture sounds? Yes. Should it interpret sounds? I don't know, maybe, you know, that sort of thing. He decided it should detect a murmur, a heart murmur. So that was his first goal. Then he said, well, how should it do it? You know, it can't just detect a murmur all by itself. I need to develop artificial intelligence. I need to train an algorithm that can take as input a heart sound and give as output, yes, there's a murmur. No, there's not. So he was thinking of that. And then all of a sudden he said, okay, let's do it. And so he started going through this, you know, prototyping and preclinical and all that. And I wrote down a couple of dates here, but, you know, it took a couple of years from the time he kind of founded this company till he actually had this product, the core. And by the way, it was a bit uglier in its first iteration. It's a lot nicer looking now, but the principle was still the same. So, you know, you have to remember that you're going through this process, but that's not the key phrase, right? That's not the key goal. The key goal, again, is safety and effectiveness, safety and effectiveness. So he had to show not that it could identify a murmur per se, but that it was safe at being used, and that it was effective. In other words, it had a very high sensitivity and specificity in this case, because as a screening device, those are the metrics you would look at. It had to do what it was intended to do safely and effectively. Now, I just wrote down here in the bottom right-hand corner that you have to remember that you can do all this and you can get through FDA if no one will pay for your device. Okay, so just keep that in mind while you're developing devices. Who's going to pay for this? And our crazy healthcare system. So just keep that in mind. That's a little free advice. It's not really part of this talk. I'm not going to go into further. All right. So how do you get to market? How do you get to market? Right, this is the money part of the talk. So at the highest level, ask yourself 4 questions. Number 1, is my product a medical device? And Chuck told me you guys have already learned about that. I'm going to go through that like super quick. Then you want to determine, is it a tool or is it really something very disease specific or population specific? And that's really important. And I'll show you what I mean by that in a second. And then again, getting back to it, how do I show that it's safe and how do I show that it's effective? Okay. Now I know this is a picture of one of you tonight, right? Sitting in bed, reading the 21 CFR, okay? Because you need to get a life. You can't do that. But anyway, okay. The first question, is it a medical device? I'm just going to point out the bold things on this slide and then we're going to move on. So if your device diagnoses a disease or condition or is used in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of a disease, it's a device. Okay, and that's kind of what we were talking about with the software thing just a second ago, right? Like software that gathers information and puts it in a health record, it doesn't do any of these things. Software that provides information to a physician who's going to treat a patient based on that information, that's a medical device. So, you know, just think about those things. Now, you know, when you look at this definition, right, I mean, it's kind of big. And we did a lot of enforcement actions against people who had products on the market. And they said, it's not a medical device. And I said, look, here's the definition. By the way, you are a medical device and you got to take it off the market until we can review it and approve it. So pretty much something that's not a drug or a biologic becomes a medical device. And these are the 5 words to remember down here on the bottom: diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, and prevention. Okay. So Chuck, was that quick enough on the medical device? I'm just going to keep going. Okay. Now, the tool versus disease specific. This is important. People don't think about this at the beginning, but this is important because this dictates the kind and amount and depth of information you need to generate. So for example, and I'm going to give you an example of a tool versus a medical device in a second, but think about your indications for use, your IFU. That is what is going to dictate to the FDA whether you're thinking about this as a general use product or something that's very focused to a specific population and or disease. So, you know, who are the device users? Who are going to be subjected to the use of the device? Because the users are not always the same as the patients, right? The doctor could be using it, but it's going to be used on a patient. Think about the conditions and diseases you're addressing. And in general, if you're coming up with very widely scoped answers, like it could be used in almost any situation on almost any patient, that's getting into that tool category. Whereas more focused is getting into that disease-specific category. And let me give you some examples. Oh, I should have done that, right? So this is the tool, right? This is the kid you all made fun of in grade school. This was me, all right? And then, you know, that's more of a tool. Like, is it a hammer, or is it something, you know, or is it a general purpose hammer, or is it really like a framing hammer that can only like hit brads or something like that? Anyway, here we go. So this is an example actually from our experience at Echo of two different types of medical devices. So on the left, I have our tool, and on the right, I have our specific application. So on the left, we have a stethoscope. What does it do? This is the actual quote from the indications for use from the IFU. It's intended to be used as part of a physical assessment of a patient by a healthcare professional for diagnostic decision support. It could be used on pediatrics or adults, and all it's supposed to actually physically do is electronically amplify, filter, and transfer sounds. That's pretty broad, right? I could do it on your heart, your lungs, your belly. I could do it on an adult or a child. I could do it in a clinic or a hospital. I could do it on anybody, anywhere. So it's not really aimed very specifically. And that is a tool application. You think of it, right? No limitations. I don't have a big burden on me to generate safety and effectiveness information, et cetera. A very specific application is our analysis software. This is our artificial intelligence software that takes the sound, and by the way, it also takes an EKG now as well, so both, but it's very specific. It evaluates heart sounds and EKG, also from the heart. It detects the presence of a murmur. It detects the presence of atrial fibrillation and normal sinus rhythm. So we're getting down to very specific inputs and very specific outputs. And so now we're talking about really a disease-specific application. So the evidence requirement is much more, is a much heavier lift for the analysis software than it is for the stethoscope. Okay, I'll just go through this really quickly. Now let me mention one thing before we get into specific pathways. When you label a product to have an IFU, it tells the user how it can be used and on what population it can be used and what it's supposed to do. It is extremely common in medicine for people to pick things up, whatever they are, drugs, biologics, devices, et cetera, and use them not according to the IFU. And that's fine, because if you're within the practice of medicine, the government does not regulate the practice of medicine. So if you wanted to take the stethoscope and listen to something else, I mean, you can do that. I used a lot of radio frequency ablation devices on organs that were not in the IFU, but it was commonly accepted medical practice to use them. Now, the takeaway of all of this is that you don't have to show safety or effectiveness for off-label uses. That's not a burden on you. But if you are aware that people could use it that way, you have to give them some explanation, some guidance in your labeling about that, okay? So if you know that people are using it in a certain way, you have to have some way of telling them, don't do certain things if people will get hurt that way. And that is on you, okay? So you do have to know that. Here's an example. And by the way, this was actually taken from a real world example, but I removed the names of the company to protect the guilty. So we have device D. It was originally cleared to do X to any tissue in any circumstance. The company knew that physicians were using it off-label to treat some other disease. Why? Well, what they did was they actually gathered data. They set up a registry. They gathered data that, you know, on its use, so they could analyze the safety and the effectiveness of the device being used in that way, in that off-label way. And they took the data and turned it to their advantage. And they went to the FDA and they said, you know, we want to expand our IFU to include both of these things now. And here's the evidence. And so today's IFU is device D is also indicated for the treatment of Y. And so this is not an unusual path. People do this reasonably frequently. So, you know, that's something that you can turn to your advantage. Now, when we're talking about getting through the process, your pathway is going to be dictated by the risk associated with your device's use. And what the statute did, what the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act did, was it divided devices into 3 classes according to risk. So class 1, the lowest risk. You know, it could be a reflex hammer for your knee or something like that. That is a very low risk device. In general, the FDA has exempted those products from pre-market review. You can introduce that product into interstate commerce without submitting a marketing application. You do have to adhere to the quality control systems, to the labeling, to the marketing, all of those regulations, but you don't have to do the marketing application. Huge time saver, huge money saver. So if you're in class 1, you're pretty much good to go as long as you comply with the general, you know, good manufacturing practices and things like that. Class 2, which is where most devices are the moderate risk devices. Now they have certain controls applied to them, which they include the general controls I mentioned earlier, like good manufacturing practices, but there are frequently special controls that may apply just to your specific device or device group, or performance standards you have to meet. So for example, if you make an electrocardiogram machine, there are internationally recognized performance standards for electrocardiogram machines. You have to adhere to them. Some of them, which are considered to be very low risk, like almost a class 1, but not quite, have been exempted from review. So we call them class 2 exempt. Others go through this pathway, which is 85% of the devices on the market. They go through the 510K pathway, which refers to the section in the law that was developed for moderate risk devices. And I'm going to talk a lot about that pathway in a second. And we call that clearance. They do get reviewed by the FDA, but it's a reasonably low bar for evidence. So, you know, we just accept the evidence that says you're equivalent to devices that are already out there. We know devices that are already out there are safe and effective. So by the transitive property, you are safe and effective and you can get out there. If you can't find a previous device, you might need to go through another pathway. And I'm going to leave this for now because I'm going to get back to it. It's called the de novo pathway. The highest risk devices like heart valves, you know, things that are much riskier, we really put them through the highest level of scrutiny. It's an individualized pathway. It doesn't have particular adherences. It doesn't have substantial equivalence determinations. You have to prove everything from scratch. So you have to show everything, all the way from your manufacturing quality to your preclinical work, your benchtop work, your clinical trials. It's obviously people want to avoid that. It takes a long time and it's very expensive, but for high risk devices, you have to do that. Now, what I will tell you is that the law says if you can't find something in class 1 or class 2 that matches your device, you are automatically classified in class 3. And that's why I'm going to talk about de novo in a second. So hold on to that thought for a second. But this slide just gives you an idea of how things are divided up. So you have a class determination, and sometimes you apply to the FDA for that. You say, what class am I in? Because you may be confused. And so FDA will do that for you. And class 1 exempt, class 2, this should say class 2. I'll fix that mistake before I give the slides in. Class 2, you can kind of go through a substantial equivalence to an already marketed device. That is the 510K, or de novo. And I said I'll talk about that in a second. Or class 3, where you have to go through like the big kahuna, right? All of the lift there. Okay, I was going to go through a number of different examples here, but in the sake of time, I'm just going to say that when my founder was looking for where he fit in the regulations with the original device, he found this. He leafed through the book and he found section 870.1875 for stethoscopes. Obviously, it's not a manual stethoscope, it's an electronic stethoscope, but he read the identification. Every one of these has an identification, and it said an electronic stethoscope is an electrically amplified device used to project sounds associated with the heart, arteries, or veins. Okay, it fits really well. I'm happy with that. What classification does it give me? Class 2, moderate risk. There are special controls, and here is the special control. The device, when it is a lung sound monitor, which this is exempt. Okay, not bad. So we basically had to go through, you know, we had to make an application because it's class 2, it's not class 1. So we had to make an application, and then we had to show we had GMP conformance, you know, quality systems, all those things, and we could introduce the product. Now, when it came to analysis software, this didn't fit anymore, right? This doesn't fit. This definition doesn't fit the analysis software. So my founder looked again through the regulations, and he found this, DOT 2300, cardiac monitor, a device used to measure the heart rate from an analog signal produced by an electrocardiograph, blah, blah, blah. Similar class 2, but now he had to demonstrate adherence and compliance to performance standards. So he had to make another 510K application for this product and then show that he was able to adhere to performance standards. So a little bit more of an evidentiary lift. Now, not all class 2s have special controls that are so nice. I just brought this out here for fun. This device is an embolic protection device. It has class 2, but special controls, and they go on and on and on. And so they go well down below the slide to show you that there's all these things that the company needs to produce for the FDA to review, like flow characteristics, tensile strengths of joints, and on it goes. So, you know, you got to read the regulation and you'll figure out what's ahead of you. And class 3, of course, as I said, has to go through PMA. This is just what a regulation looks like for class 3. All right, so you figured out, you got your device, you looked at the regulations, you said, okay, I fit in this pathway, 1, 2, or 3, what do I do? Well, we already talked about class 1, right? Minimum, find the appropriate regulation, register your firm, list the device on the FDA database, ensure you comply with the minimum regulations necessary to be a good manufacturer, and you're ready to go. Class 2, not exempt. You really got to look for that, what we call predicate, because you're going to try to make an argument that you are substantially equivalent to a device that's already marketed, which means you are looking for a predicate. And so you're going to say, who else is out there? Who else can I compare myself to? In the case of a stethoscope, there's a lot of things you can find. There are other electronic stethoscopes out there that have been there for a while. You know, Littman has made one for like 14 years. So we can go to the FDA and say, look, here's a Littman stethoscope. Here's my stethoscope. I'm going to show you it's exactly as safe. I'm going to show you it's exactly as effective. And there are no concerns about changes in technology or safety or effectiveness. If you can do that, you will get marketing clearance. This is a slide for your reference, in that there are different ways to get marketing clearance in the 510K. I'm going to just skip over that to keep moving. This 807.87 is the laundry list of things you need to produce in a marketing application. I'm just going to focus your attention on F and G. You need to provide a statement that says the device is similar to, or how it's different from, a device of comparable, comparable type that's already in commercial distribution. And sometimes this is easy. Sometimes you got to generate data. So it all depends on where you are. You know, you could maybe sit down and make this a tabletop exercise, or you might need to go do some bench research, or maybe an animal study. Could be a limited clinical study, but that's pretty rare. And then you need to show that you have considered what the consequences and effects of a change or modification might have on the safety or effectiveness. So just, you know, those are the ones that are the big heavy lift. Okay. I think I pretty much beat to death what a predicate is. Okay, I think you guys understand that now, but I want you to be aware that predicates can be compound. And by that I mean, like if you have a device, like let's say our 2nd generation device, right? This thing that can do both electrical recordings and sound recordings, you could put together a predicate, one of which is a sound recording like a stethoscope, and another might be a device that just does electrical recordings. And then you can show that you are substantially equivalent to the combination of them. So you can do clever things. And as long as you can show that it's safe and effective at doing what you intend to do, you'll be in a good space. Okay, so we had a predicate. We got the Duo device, which is the one I just showed you, on the market by doing exactly that. We showed it was substantially equivalent to an acoustic stethoscope and an electronic stethoscope and a single lead ECG recording device. I won't give you any names, but you get the idea. There's like 261 companies out there under the same product code, so we found something. Now, what if you can't find a predicate? Remember I told you, or if FDA comes back and says, no, we don't like your predicate, which is called NSE, or not substantially equivalent. a bad letter that nobody wants to get. You can apply to the FDA for what's called a determination, and that is covered under Section 513G of the law, which says that if you are considered to be not substantially equivalent or you can't find a predicate, you can ask the FDA what class they think the device is in, and they will say class 1 or 2, or rarely they'll say 3. And then you will have to go through what's called the de novo pathway. The de novo pathway, right? De novo means from the beginning. So you have to generate more evidence, but not as much as you would with a high-risk device. So you're kind of in this space in between. So the de novo was really invented for devices of low or moderate risk that didn't have a predicate. And so what happens at the end of the de novo process is when you work interactively with the FDA to come up with the evidentiary requirements, because remember, you're in an uncharted space, right? There's no predicate, there's no regulation, but you're not in class 3, so you don't have to do the whole PMA thing. You're going to work with the FDA interactively to come up with the evidentiary requirements. Then you're going to have to go and fulfill them. It might mean a clinical trial, it might not. It might mean more bench work, it might not. It's an interactive thing because you're blazing a new path. You are then going to result with a brand new regulation that's yours. And you're going to be the first device in that new regulation. Other devices that come down the pike later can use you as a predicate. Okay, so that's the de novo pathway as quickly as I can describe it.
There's a really interesting question in chat, Dr. Saltman, about whether arguing a predicate substantial equivalence might be viewed by, let's say, patent law as not novel.
So yes and no. Totally depends on the situation. So for example, with our Duo device, there's no device on the market that both picks up sound and electrical signals. So this is quite novel, right? I didn't have to do a de novo because we were able to make the argument to the FDA that there were 2 predicates, we were substantially equivalent to both of them, and we were fine. On the other hand, you could make just another stethoscope. If you want to make it cheaper or better or whatever, doesn't have different technological characteristics. So the FDA is okay with that. That's a good predicate. But you know, you might want to be an also ran for half price. And so you take over the market as a commodity. That's done too. So the answer is it depends.
That may be arguable, right? Because 1 + 1 is obvious, then you will not get a patent. So I think that's a different topic. I think the issue is, does the FDA consider 1 + 1 as safe and effective as 1 and 1? I mean, it's not about novelty, it's about safety and efficacy. So I think we got to separate the two, and I don't think the two are the same.
Yes, so I had in one of these slides down here, 1 + 1 = 1. And I think that answers your question, because you can put these two things together and make something new out of it, but because you're not showing any safety or effectiveness concerns, you are considered to be as safe and effective as already marketed products. And that's the way the law puts it. So, so yeah, it doesn't, right. I hope that was helpful. This is an example of a de novo product that had no predicate. By caption guidance, they basically capture ultrasounds and have artificial intelligence that gives the physician an interpretation of the images they're seeing. There was nothing out there like that, but it was not high risk. So caption guidance went through the de novo pathway. They were granted DEN 190040, and they developed an entirely new regulation for that, and there's the number of the regulation, for radiological acquisition and or optimization guidance systems. So that now serves as the predicate for other devices that would go into that space. And they would go through a more standard 510K process to show substantial equivalence to the caption guidance device, and whatever devices may end up in that space. Now, class 3, the pre-market application, the PMA, the big lift, I am not going to go through these slides. What I did here for you was list the required components that are listed in 814.20 that you have to produce, and these run thousands of pages. And a big multidisciplinary team gets together at FDA composed of clinicians and engineers and statisticians and on to go through your application. And frequently this will be presented to an expert panel. It's called going to panel. It's a whole bunch of lay people consisting also of scientists and statisticians and engineers and physicians who review the application and essentially provide their input whether the device should be approved for marketing. So this is a big lift. Less than 15% of products go through this. I would say in a typical year, FDA does about 50 of these, so, or less, not that many. The vast majority go through the 510K pathway. The vast majority are class 2 devices who can demonstrate predicates or are clever at demonstrating predicates. And then for the de novos, probably I would say it's getting busier and busier. I think before I left the FDA a few months ago, they were on track to do about 50 de novos in that year. So it's getting busier, probably still underutilized. And so here you can see you have to summarize your studies, you have to give complete descriptions of everything, you have to reference any performance standards, do an entire technical discussion of all the aspects of the device, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see this is taken up like 5 slides. So this is here for you to go through at your leisure, or if you want to leaf through section 815.20, you're free to do so. But I'm just trying to give you the impression that these are big undertakings. And of course, you know, if you end up being approved, that is a huge accomplishment. That's, you know, that's fantastic. But those are things that are reserved for major high-risk devices. So I just want to say one thing about clinical investigations and evidence, and then I'm done. If you're going to get involved in clinical investigations, you're going to be studying humans. There are additional regulations you need to be aware of, not just in food and drugs. So not just in Title 21, which includes Part 50 and Part 56, which is all about human study, human subjects research, but also in Title 45, which is from the Health and Human Services. So Part 46 talks about protection of human services. Part 164, which mainly came out of the HIPAA law, has to do with the security and privacy of information from human subjects. So you got to know those things, and you have to be much more rigorous about any kind of statistical planning. You really need to sit down. There's frequently a conversation, what we call a pre-submission with the FDA, where you talk about proposals for studies. I want to study 5,000 subjects, and I want to show that there is equivalence to the standard of care and blah, 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 and all the, you know, the confidence intervals, all of that stuff comes out during that discussion. And your eyes will glaze over when the statisticians start talking about it, but this is really important stuff. And there also will be requirements, mandatory requirements imposed on you for class 3 devices to do things like reporting annually on the safety and effectiveness of your device every year. How many were used, how were they used, what were the problems, et cetera. And every now and then, if FDA feels that you've got a marginal application, like the evidence is not quite there, they'll give you approval, but they'll inflict a thing on you called a 522 post-market surveillance study, where they'll mandate you do a separate clinical trial gathering evidence from real-world use. And so that occasionally happens too. So you need to be aware of that. Sometimes, you know, if the benefit of the device use outweighs the risk, you'll get your approval, you'll get on the market, but you'll have a burden to continue generating evidence into the future. We're out of time, so I'm not going to talk about our low ejection fraction algorithm, but it was an example of something we're getting through the FDA right now, and we're talking with them about exactly these things, because we're standing up a clinical trial in an entirely new space. It's a de novo, but we're doing a clinical trial to generate evidence, and I'm happy to talk about it more if you guys would like to, but it was just an example. So I think I covered these things, at least I hope I did, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm very happy to stick around and answer questions, so you let me know. And I know Jeff wants to go on vacation, so not too many questions, okay? But anyway, literally. So, and there's some references at the end here for you guys, some links and stuff you can click on and, you know, get quickly to these various resources. CDRH Learn is fantastic. It goes into real depth on any of these topics and more. And Device Advice is also very good kind of for you guys starting out. So that's it. happy to entertain questions, dirty jokes, etc.
Well, thank you, Dr. Saltman. I think I'm unmuted here.
Yes.
Oh, good. Well,
I have a question.
so good. Yeah, if further questions, if you can unmute and ask the question and just avoid conflicts with the audio, not the speaker.
Can I go first, Chuck?
Sure.
Thanks so much for the talk, Dr. Saltman. That was great. And I might actually ask your permission and Chuck later to share this with my design team course. So I have a big picture question. You talked a bit about pathways for new things that are better or cheaper. I'm wondering what happens with, so if we're thinking about the transition to value-based care, there might be new solutions that are maybe a little bit worse than predicates, but orders of magnitude cheaper. So I'm wondering if there's what's the pathway for that? If you have something that can be done with a smartphone instead of a $20,000 device, and say it's
right,
then it's good. What's the pathway for translating that?
So that is you have touched on an argument that is raging inside the FDA right now, because if you want to be really strictly, let's say, traditionalist about it, the FDA is blind to cost. We are not supposed to consider the cost of the device. And that, you know, when you really think about it, that is not right. That shouldn't be. I mean, if you are presenting something that is as safe, maybe even a little bit less effective, but way cheaper and therefore much more available, you know, that should get some kind of consideration in the whole deliberative process, but it's not. And so we have this argument all the time, because especially if it's not exactly as effective, right? I mean, the traditionalists will say, well, I'm sorry, it's not as effective as the predicate, it's not substantially equivalent, and they'll throw it out. Whereas others of us, call it the traditionalists versus the realists, I guess, the others of us will argue that, but this has so much more benefit because it would be way more available, people could afford it, etc. And so we try to make the benefit risk argument to carry the day. But no one has come out at the FDA with a real policy statement that we should consider it that way. And I think the traditionalists who are blind to cost end up prevailing more often than not.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope that answered your question. But what we try to do, though, it's interesting, we try to put together, there's a thing called parallel review. We have a program called parallel review. I'm not part of the FDA anymore. The FDA has a thing called parallel review, where we bring together CMS and FDA at the beginning of this whole process, so that CMS can bring up its concerns and questions at the same time that FDA is looking for safety and effectiveness data. And so that way the manufacturer can be aware of any potential obstacles. You don't want to get your device on the market and you find out like CMS is not going to cover it or something like that. That's a disaster, right? You want to head that off. So if you have a device like that, I just strongly suggest that you ask the FDA during the preliminary stages for a parallel review.
For all our audience, CMS is, some people might not know.
It is the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and it basically administers all the money that goes through Medicare or Medicaid, and it covers, it's like 100 million people in the United States. It covers a ton of people. And so a lot of third-party health insurance providers will follow CMS's lead. If CMS covers it, most of them will cover it almost automatically. So if you get CMS on your side, that goes a long way. If you make